Belief, faith, but flawed faith, foolish self-reliance. But some good things come out of the bad things that happen. So that's why it's so much like life. You know, some people read chapter 9, and for them, if you read through the commentaries and the sermons and things you can find online, some people see the events of chapter 9 as the first step in Israel's failure. It's the first time that Israel fails to do what God commanded them to do, which is to destroy all the peoples in the land of Canaan. So for them, chapter 9 is a cautionary tale. If you don't do explicitly what God says, further down the line, you're going to see it snowball, as we saw the conquest kind of fell apart at the end. And eventually, Israel itself would become contaminated with pagan ideas. And finally, the 10 tribes in the north are just lost. Judah is taken into captivity. So for them, this is the first step in a snowball effect that's going to end in the end of Israel's faithfulness. Terrible precedent. First step in Israel's religious apostasy. On the other hand, a different group of people, different readers, see these events as an instance of God's grace, how God works in history. They see this as a continuation of what happened with Rahab. Remember, Rahab was a Canaanite, but she expressed her faith in God. She was rescued and became in the line of Jesus Christ. So they see this is like Rahab. Some people have faith. It's an imperfect faith, a selfish faith, but they have it, and they're given a place in God's people, even though they were told to destroy these people. But for them, Abraham was saved by faith. And the people discussed in this chapter, they're also rescued by their faith. So it's not their perfect lives, certainly. They're pagans with abominable religious practices. And not even a perfect faith, but it is a real faith. And that's enough to get them a small part, a servile part, to be sure, among God's people. So maybe the best conclusion is just this. All things work together for good. Not all things are always good, but all things bad and good can work together for good. To those who love God. That's the first group of people here. We have to say that at this point, Joshua loves God. The people of Israel, they love God. Not with just an emotional attraction to God, but they had just reaffirmed their covenant with God at Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, as we saw last week. They are fervently for God, as we will see. So they loved God. Not only those who love God, but to those who are called according to His purpose. Well, we know the Israelites were called according to God's purpose. God's purpose for Israel was to have a people who would know the true God, who would uphold the morality that God wants for human lives, who would have a religion that prepared through their sacrifices and everything else, prepared the world for the coming of the Messiah, and then have a seedbed in which the Messiah would be born to minister to all the nations. So Israel is called according to God's purpose. They love God. So my belief is all things work together for good. Even though bad things happen, God worked them for good. But I'll leave that up to you. Does this episode mark the first in Israel's decline, or is it God's grace? Both of those ideas are out there. It applies to us in its ambiguity. Was that good or bad? I don't know. Every one of us who's ever made a bad decision of some kind and lived through it and saw some good come out of that bad decision, we can relate. It comes out of an error, a mistake, a sin. It doesn't come because of the sin, but in spite of that, all things work together for good. I think all of us can say, yes, I've seen good things come out of bad situations. So That's the kind of case we're in. So as we go through chapter 9, I want to do it sort of in three stages. One is just, here are the events that happened, if you haven't already read that in your Bibles. Here are the events that happened, and then the errors that occurred, and then the good that came out of it. And then we'll kind of conclude at that point. What happened? Well, after the defeat and destruction of Ai, the surrounding cities forgot all about their squabbles, and they said, we've got to do something to stop the Israelites. So they band together, all these different kings, and combined forces against Israel. Verse 2 of chapter 9 says, they came together as one. The Hebrew is even more graphic. It says, they came together as one mouth. We're going to be one wolf, one bear, one dragon, and we're going to just gobble them up. So they all combine. But one city didn't join that coalition, and that was the city of Gibeon. What did Gibeon do? Well, they chose some men to pose as emissaries or ambassadors. They put on old worn-out clothes and sandals that were worn out and patched. They put worn-out blankets on their donkeys and got some moldy bread and some wineskins that had been patched and the wine was rancid. And they made their way down to Gilgal, where Israel was. It wasn't that far. Gibeon was about 18 miles. I've read everything from 16 to 20 miles. We'll say 18. I guess it depends on what road you take or whatever. It wasn't that far away, but that terrain is rough. Gilgal is below sea level, and Gibeon is nearly 4,000 feet above sea level. It's rough terrain, it's steep terrain, and so they just hadn't been there and didn't know about Gibeon. So they send these men, and they go to Gilgal, Israel's base camp, and they say this is a quotation, we've come from a long distance. We want to make a covenant with you. Well, Joshua says, how do we know you're not from somewhere nearby? Well, in fact, they were. Maybe you're lying, Joshua says. If you're from one of the cities of this area, we can't make a covenant with you. And here's what the Gibeonite delegation said. I'm quoting now from the ESV, chapter 9, verse 9. Here's what they say. From a very distant country, your servants have come, because of the name of the Lord your God. For we have heard a report of him, and all that he did in Egypt, and all that he did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon, the king of Heshbon, and to Og, king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our country said to us, take provisions in your hand for the journey, and go to meet them and say to them, we are your servants. Come now, make a covenant with us. How much truth, how much lie was wrapped up in all of that? Well, I mean, they did believe, didn't they? They believed enough, like Rahab believed, that they said, we're not going to win. We've got to get on the winning side. So here they come with this story. Did they believe? I would say yes, they did. Are they honest? No, they're not. Pick up in verse 12. Here's what they say. Here's the proof they offer. Joshua says, how do I know you're not lying? They say, here's our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. But now, behold, it's dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, and behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the long journey. So they're saying, just look at us. Can't you tell we've been on the road a long time, come a long distance? By the way, have you thought about this? How do all these people talk to each other? How do Hivites go in there and start talking to Israelites? And all of these groups speak to each other. Well, there's two answers to them. One is Hebrew is actually a Canaanite religion in the sense that all of these different Canaanite dialects and Hebrew, they're all part of what's called Northwest Semitic branch of languages. So they had a lot in common with each other. And experts who know say It's like Spanish, and certain dialects of Portuguese, which is mutually intelligible. Or it's like Polish and Ukrainian, which have 60 to 75% overlap. Actually, Polish is closer and more easily understood than is Russian. You'd think that Russian was closer, but it's not. So they're in the same family group. It's like Romance languages, so they could communicate. But there's another answer. The, quote, international language of the Middle East at this time was something called Akkadian, a language called Akkadian. And what's interesting, if we had time, I think I did this once before in the past. There's a group of cuneiform tablets they discovered at Tutanakham's city. They're called the Amarna tablets. But these Amarna tablets are written, well, the ones that come from Canaan are written in Akkadian, which was the sort of international language. It's as if, you're in India, you want to communicate with Bangladesh, you might use English because that's kind of the international language of communication. What's fascinating about those Amarna letters, those tablets, is we find these Canaanite kings of these little city-states saying, come help us. The Habiru or the Hapiru are just running over everybody. Worse yet, some people are siding with them, and we need your help, Pharaoh, to come and help us. We're your vassals, which they were. Well, Egypt didn't want to get involved with the Hebrews again, and so they just kind of ignored that. But that's an interesting footnote. But they used Akkadian, which was this international language of communication. So that's how all of these people are able to show up and talk to each other. But here's what happened. The men of Joshua, they look at the evidence. Joshua says, check them out, guys, and they do. So Joshua makes a covenant with them. You're our allies. You're our vassals, technically. That is, we're the head. You are below us, but we are allies, all for one and one for all. But it's hard to maintain a lie. It only took 3 days for the truth to come out. These people didn't come from a long distance. They came from a long day's journey away, 18 miles. And they are the very people you're supposed to be destroying. Well, the people of Israel went up to the city of Gibeon. As it turns out, there were 3 other little smaller towns or small cities, whatever you want to call them, that were part of that whole plan. They were Gibeonites too. Even though they didn't live in Gibeon, they were these allied, sort of like, Dasher and Remerton or something in Valdosta. They were allied with them, part of them. The Israelite warriors said, these stinkers lied to us. God told us to destroy them. Well, let's kill them. The leaders in Joshua said, no, we're not going to do that. We made a covenant with them. We're going to keep our covenant. But then Joshua met with the leaders of Gibeon and said, you guys lied to us. Because you did that, you're not just our vassal. From here on out, you will have to provide hewers of wood and drawers of water for the tabernacle of God. Well, as you can imagine, it took a lot of all that ceremonial washing, filling up that big brass thing called the sea, big bronze thing called the sea, a lot of wood for all the sacrifices. Your city will have to provide those things. Your men. Well, we'll read more about this in chapter 10. Chapter 10 is the end of the story. But in chapter 10, the other cities in the area combined and said, let's go destroy Gibeah to make an object lesson. No one side with Israel or you'll be destroyed like we destroyed Gibeon. So that's what they did. Gibeonites begged Israel to come help them, and they did, and we'll discover more about that next week. So what's wrong? What went wrong in this human world? Number one, the Gibeonites lied. Now, it may have been a smart lie. It was a necessary lie. What if they hadn't lied? What were their choices? Fight and die? They were convinced that they would die. Or they could leave their houses, leave their livelihood. They could pack up the donkeys and just become refugees. And where do you go? And how do you know you won't be robbed and cheated and killed on the way? So this was their best option, was to lie their way out of it. What would you do? Somebody said that, pick a country. The Chinese are coming. They're going to kill you. That's just all there is to it. Well, do you fight? Do you pack up and drive the car to Alabama and try to start over, or do you try to make a deal with the invading army? So that's where they are. So what about Joshua and the Israelites? Well, verse 14 says they took some of the Gibeonites' provisions. That means they examined their provisions. They went through and looked, yeah, it's moldy, yes, it's worn out, and they were happy with that. They just took it at face value. Here's what Proverbs 18:17 says. The one who states his case first seems right until another comes and examines him. In this world, it's sad to say, things are more likely not to be what they seem than they are to actually be what they seem. But Joshua and his men just took things on face value. Here, okay, yeah, you're right, it's old stuff. You must have come from a long way. You can be too suspicious, but you can be too gullible. They were too gullible. Somebody calls you on the phone and says, congratulations, you just won a weeks-long vacation in Florida. All we need is your credit card to confirm a couple of things and you're good to go. Yeah, right. But that's kind of where they were. They signed the contract without really doing their due diligence there. Somebody comes in smiling, extending his hand. He must be a good guy. But 2 Peter 2 warns us against false prophets who secretly bring in destructive heresies and exploit you with false words. Everything that glitters isn't gold, but they just accepted at face value, what these people told them. Superficial examination. More than that, they made a covenant that day. What if they said, well, that's interesting, give us a couple of days to think about it, and done a little investigation. But they just accepted it, signed on the dotted line without doing any due diligence about that. Verse 15 identifies a more serious lapse. Verse 15. Joshua did not inquire of the Lord. Joshua didn't even bother to go off in a corner and pray to God. The priest had those stones, and you could use them kind of a yes, no, almost like a way to foretell the future if God could speak. They didn't even ask the priest to use those stones and say, should we make a deal with these people? Yes or no? They didn't even do that. Did not inquire of the Lord. What happened the last time Joshua didn't inquire of the Lord? Well, he didn't ask the Lord about Ai. He just sent some spies. The spies said, 2,000 or 3,000 will do it. He took their word for it. They sent 3,000 men and got defeated, humiliated, and all those bad things that happened that we read before. Why didn't Joshua ask the Lord? Maybe he thought, well, God has given us the job. He's ready to hand it over to us now. Maybe he thought, before, God always kind of spoke to us first. We don't know what's in his mind, but he didn't inquire of the Lord. That's kind of a problem. I forgot to click on the screens here. So let's go back and see, again, continuing how the bad things that happened, how things went wrong. Let's go back to the chapter, see how Joshua's hasty covenant led him to directly violate God's explicit orders. Verses 6 and 7. And they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a distant country, so now make a covenant with us. But the men of Israel said to the Hivites, that's who they are, Hivites, perhaps you live among us. How can we make a covenant with you? The people of Gibeon belonged to a people group called the Hivites. The table of nations in Genesis 10 says the Hivites were descendants of Canaan, who was a descendant of Ham. The city of Shechem, where Dinah was raped, and then Levi and Simeon tricked them in and slaughtered them, and all those bad things happened there, that was a Hivite city. Joshua 11:3 refers to Hivites that lived a lot further north. So the Hivites were all throughout that land of Canaan. So the people of Gibeon were some of the Hivites, but they weren't all the Hivites. But Israel had explicit instructions about the Hivites. They were one group that was specifically singled out for destruction. Let's go further and get a little more context to this. God didn't tell Israel to destroy every people they came in contact with. Look at what he says in Deuteronomy 20, verse 10. When you draw near a city to fight against it, offer terms of peace to it. And if it responds to you peaceably, and it opens to you, then all the people who are found in it shall do forced labor for you and shall serve you. But if it makes no peace with you, but makes war against you, then you shall besiege it. So their general command when they meet other peoples, you meet them, you give them a choice. Offer them terms of peace. If they agree to peace, then they will do forced labor for you. What was that forced labor? Well, we're not really sure. It wasn't like the American slave system was, for example, where families were broken up, individuals bought and sold, fragmented. The community still lived together. They were Gibeonites hundreds of years later. They continued to live in their own communities, but they were forced to provide men for particular projects. David, and especially Solomon, used a lot of Canaanites as forced labor to build all of his building projects. So you men have to give us, 100 days every year working for us. Or you got to give us half of your men working all the time, or whatever the deal was, but provided forced labor. So that's what they're to offer. That's harsh, not as harsh as it could have been, as it often was in those days. Typically, conquered people, or people who surrendered, were just plundered. You went in and took whatever you wanted. You said, okay, we'll let you live. We're taking whatever we want. They didn't do that. They didn't say, we're going to tax you till you can barely eat, refried beans to stay alive. Didn't do that. We are going to require you to work for our projects. And that's the requirement, the forced labor. That was the general requirement. And in the context of the day and time, that was a compassionate requirement. Well, but 5 times in the book of Exodus, the book of Deuteronomy, God says that I will drive out these particular Canaanite groups. Each time the Hivites are explicitly mentioned. Exodus 23:23, God says through Moses, an angel will go before you and blot them out. Angel will do it. Exodus 23:28, I will send hornets before you to drive them out, blot them out, drive them out. I will do it. Exodus 33:2, an angel will drive them out. Exodus 34:11, God says, I will drive them out. Deuteronomy 7:1 says, God will clear out 7 nations mightier than you are. This is another footnote. The calculations that people make say there must have been around 2 million people making the Exodus. That's a lot of people. If there were 7 nations mightier than Israel, so that gives us 8 times 2 million. That's a lot of people. And for that reason, a lot of people say they must have calculated numbers differently, and there's all kinds of ways that could have happened. We don't know. But the bottom line is these are mightier peoples, bigger armies, bigger cities than the Israelites who have no cities. But God said, you have your part. He says, I will blot them out, I will clear them out, I will drive them out. But he says to Israel, you have your part to play in moving into the land of Canaan. Verse 16, but in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. And here's the list: Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices. Specifically identified them 5 times. We didn't read all 5, but he says, I'm telling you, your job is to utterly destroy and leave nothing breathing when these people fight against you, because they will corrupt you. That's tough love to a limit. That offends our Christian sensibility. That was the day and that was a time. Israel had to do its part. And they didn't. They let a group of a city and 3 other towns of Hivites survive. Here's the question. Joshua didn't do his due diligence. He didn't investigate. He made a covenant with the very people he's supposed to be destroying. And here's the question. Now what do I do? Now what do we do? You may have been in that position in your life. I messed up. Now what do I do? That's a serious question. And it leaves a lot of people racked with guilt, anxiety, regret, can't forgive themselves. I made a mistake. Now what do I do? What can we learn from Joshua's big mistake? We've all made them. He's the leader of Israel, and he led the whole nation into a gross disobedience right after they affirmed their faithfulness to God's covenant. Just so many times at the highest spiritual point, suddenly when you think you stand, you fall, and here they are in this terrible disobedience. Can any good come out of that mistake? So let's look at the good side. Yeah. Oh, yes. I mean, that's exactly their idea. You're for us, or we completely destroy you. Well, like this, it's the same, I don't know, moral algebra or something. But in Islam, if you agree to live in what I think the term for it is dimitude, you have no rights, you're second class, and you just shut up and you just give them whatever they want and they'll let you live. But if you resist or if you fail to say what they require at particular times, then you will be destroyed. So it's the same mindset that they had. Again, from our Christian perspective, that's just, we don't understand that. Okay. What good happened out of all of this? First of all, as we mentioned, the Gibeonites had a real faith in God, a sincere faith in God. It wasn't a perfect faith, but they really believed, like Rahab really believed, that God was really God and that Israel would really win because God was really on their side. They really believed that. And they didn't retreat into denial or fantasy or, oh, we can take them on, or let's go find some help and we can win. They knew the score. They had heard reports about what God had done, and they believed him. They didn't doubt it. They were no more moral, no more godly than Rahab was, but they spared Rahab because she believed. When they heard of God's coming judgment, They took action in the only way they knew how, the best way they knew how. Think about another case. Jesus tells a parable of an unjust steward who had been misappropriating some money and was going to get fired. Jesus said, "What did this man do?" Well, he went to the people who owed money to his master, and they cooked the books. He said, I've forgotten the numbers, I'll make these up. You owe 10,000 bottles of wine, let's rewrite that contract for 5,000. And he went around to various creditors, and he rewrote the contracts. And Jesus commended him, not for his dishonesty or shadiness, but he said this guy was smart. He saw coming judgment and took the steps he needs to do to survive. That's how each and every one of us is. When we realize that a pure, holy God will one day judge us, we got to do something. We can say, "Oh, not now," or "They're not attacking us now," or whatever. But they said, "We've got to do something," and they did it. They took action to secure their future. They didn't rebel, didn't find a coalition. They didn't say, "Well, they're not touching us now, maybe they won't bother us." They didn't do any of that. They just got on the winning side. They didn't do that because they were weak, by the way. Chapter 10, the first few verses of chapter 10 continue this story a little bit. It says that Gibeon was a great city, quote, like a royal city, and that all of its men were warriors. Some translations say all of the men were mighty men. So this was a strong city with a strong military, well provisioned. They didn't just run because we're too weak. They ran because they believed that God was on Israel's side. Okay, so they believed. What else? The people of Gibeon were humble. When they came to Joshua, they said, "We are your servants." Joshua called them out for their lies later on, pronounced sentence on them, and they said, "Do with us as you will." Talk about total submission. So many times today we talk about submitting to God, coming to God in submission. C.S. Lewis talks about his conversion, and he says, in some ways it seemed anticlimactic. It was like a decision. I know this is right. I don't feel it. All of this stuff isn't there. But he decided. Something like that. They were humble. They decided. They didn't bow up. They didn't beg. They didn't make excuses. They just threw themselves on God's mercy. Maybe they had heard enough about God to know that God is fair and just. But they just said, "We're your servants. Whatever you say, we'll do it." Then Joshua made the right decision. As I mentioned earlier, if you read the whole chapter, the warriors of Israel said, "Your leaders were deceived, and that put us all in a bad spot." Joshua, the other leaders, "You were deceived, you put us all in a bad spot." The warriors of Israel wanted to go to Gibeon and attack the city and destroy it. Why did they want to do that? Because Achan, one man, disobeyed, and the entire military suffered. They're thinking this is going to be AI over again on steroids. And if we try to conquer any other people with this great sin against us, God will not be on our side. That makes sense. But here's our closing question, what all this is leading up to in a way. When we mess up, should we go back and try to undo the past? Fix the errors, the things we shouldn't have done in the past? Or should we do the next right thing, as Brian Jarvis used to love to say? What do you do when you find yourself that you made a mistake? What's the right answer? Do I undo it? Do I do the next right thing? Joshua says, we won't undo the past. We will honor our oath. Keep our covenant. We'll keep the present oath. God's honor is at stake. Romans 12:17, give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. 2 Corinthians 8:21, we aim at what is honorable not only in the Lord's sight, but also in the sight of man. 1 Peter 2:12. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. Israel's among the Gentiles. If God is a good God, a fair God, an honorable God, then they will keep their contract with these people, even though it violated a command. Breaking an oath, even if you're tricked into breaking it, is worse than a failure to obey. So Joshua does the next right thing. Today, I shouldn't have signed that contract. I can't do that job for that price. Or we've got a debt. I can't pay that. I got to get out. Or we've got family issues we want to change. I'll just bail out. Do we undo the past? Or do we do the next right thing, the honorable thing, to keep the promise, keep the contract, keep things going? Well, we know what happened. But because they were deceived, Joshua says, we're going to treat you the way we're to treat other nations that are not Canaanites. That is, you will do forced labor. But he says this, you will do forced labor in the temple. And what's going to happen when these Gibeonites are in the temple hewing wood and hauling water? They will see the daily sacrifices. They will hear the prayers. They will see the feasts. They will learn about a God who is very different from their bloodthirsty, immoral gods. And they will be changed. So what a wise act. He says, yes, you can live. We're not going to try to undo the past. But here's what you will do. And it's one that worked out. Years later, when Solomon built the temple, there was the court of the Gentiles. I'm sure there were Gibeonites in that court of the Gentiles, not Jews, but believers. So what happened? They were the first of a lot of Gentiles coming into Israel. Happened a lot of days and times. Judah married a Canaanite woman named Shua, Genesis 38. Joseph married an Egyptian woman. The mixed multitude came out. We don't know how many stayed with them, but they came. We're told that these sojourners who weren't Jews met at Mount Ebal and Gerizim to hear God's covenant, and they had the promise to follow it too. They're being drawn in to God's will and God's people. You think about Moses married a Midianite woman, a descendant of Abraham, but not of Jacob. Maybe married a Canaanite woman if she was different from the Midianite woman, if they were not two names for the same person. Rahab, Ruth, the Moabitess, all of that. Maybe the Hivites were part of, Hivites of Gibeon were part of that great outreach to the Gentile world. Did they deserve death? Yes. Did you deserve death? Did I deserve death? We all deserve death. We're all, in a sense, like Gibeonites. All we can do is come to God and say, you are all powerful. I submit. Do with me as you will. We come in faith. We submit. We're allowed in. I don't know about you, but I'm happy to be a hewer of wood and a bearer of water in God's kingdom. If that's what he wants me to do, if he says, yes, you deserve death, but you can live and serve in this way, I'm happy to serve in whatever way I can. Gibeonites continued real quick. I'll just read these to you. In 2 Samuel 21:2, King Saul tried to destroy the Gibeonites. Why did he do that? He failed to kill all the Amalekites, and God was angry. So now Saul says, I'll go back and undo Joshua's problem. I'll kill all of the Gibeonites. He kills some. God is angry and sends 3 years of drought. And David finally finds out the problem and solves it. It involves some of Saul's family dying. Gibeonites served in David's army. The leader of the 30 heroes was a Gibeonite. And 95 Gibeonites came back from the Babylonian captivity. And they're listed as helping rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. A binding, lasting change in these people occurred because of a mistaken disobedience. good things can come out of bad things. All things do work together for good, I believe, for those who love the Lord.